We have faculty nominate speakers, every year. And in my introduction of Akira, because so many of you know her so well, I'll say that Akira is always introducing speakers who come to our department and really challenge us to bring new perspectives of race, of justice, of displacement, of the intersection between housing and mobility under these lenses. And I know I deeply appreciate it. I have, since we started being colleagues, and I continue to do so. And so thank you, Akira, for continuing that tradition. And for inviting Lisa Bates. Those of you who know Akira know her deep expertise in these areas that I just mentioned, also her engagement in the community, her impact in the community and on community groups, and of course, as many of you have gotten to experience in the classroom. Akira is also a co-editor of Disrupting Urban Policy, with Lance, yes, Lance Freeman right here in our department, and also an award-winning scholar. So thank you very much for being here, and I invite Akira up here to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. You don't have to clap. Thanks. I'm very thrilled to introduce the wonderful human and scholar that is Lisa K. Bates, PhD. Lisa, I'm going to read your bio from the site. I hope that's okay. But I'm going to add some sprinkles. Dr. Bates is professor in Black Studies at Portland State University. She is affiliated with the Tulane School of Urban Studies and Planning and is the Portland Professor in Innovative Housing Policy. So many titles, congratulations. Her scholarship focuses on housing and community development policy and planning. Recognition of her work includes the 2019 UAA Sage Marilyn J. Gattell Activist Scholar Award, a very important award in my field because Lisa studies, does, practices, teaches everything. And the 2016 Dale Prize for Scholarship Advancing Community Self-Determination and Racial Justice. Dr. Bates' research and practice includes deep engagements with community-based organizations working towards racial justice and housing rights, including Portland's Anti-Displacement Coalition. If we have time, please ask Lisa about all the wonderful work that she's done in New Orleans, such an inspiration. And she did a lot of really excellent stuff at conferences and beyond around the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina last year. Her work to describe gentrification and displacement in Portland has been widely cited and used as a model for planning to address neighborhood change. I know for a fact that we teach your work on equity planning revisited in our history and theory required course. Dr. Bates leads the Evicted in Oregon team, which tracks eviction cases, evaluates public policy, and uses community-based methods to develop insights and ideas about housing justice. I had the privilege to moderate a panel with a lot of these scholars who were doing excellent research in planning around anti-eviction work in Portland at the Urban Affairs Conference last year in Vancouver. Really, some of just gave me faith in eviction work again, the way they were sort of breaking down what is actually happening in the home and what's actually happening in the city and the neighborhood in response to this new world of eviction. Dr. Bates is a 2019 Creative Capital awardee, big deal, recognizing her practice at the intersection of art, urban planning, and radical geographic thought. I'm going to give you your background now. I know it's a lot of stuff. I'm sorry. It's longer than I thought. I'm skipping around though. You have a BA in poli-sci from GW, which I did not know, which is amazing, and a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. For those who do or don't know, Lisa did advise and was on the committee of Jamal Green here, who I just saw right here, yes. And so you'll soon see that synergy very soon. I'm gonna get down, but just a pleasure, thank you so much. Fun fact, we have the same birthday. Everyone's mostly.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Thank you for having me and inviting me. It's so great to be back here. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Portland, Oregon, and the idea of reparative planning in Portland's urban renewal area. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the empirical research that I've done, but also kind of open up to the broader conversation around what's happening now in Portland. So I must really endorse reading Rashad Williams and Justin Steele's article, The Past We Step Into and How We Repair It, a normative framework for reparative planning. I think this is a really important opening in a conversation around what it would mean to have the reparations conversation more broadly brought down. And when I say reparations, I'm speaking primarily of reparations for Black Americans around various historical injustices. How do we bring that down to the ground in terms of urban planning, our policy, our practice, our plan making? And it turns out that there's some very significant challenges in between the concept or the spirit of repair and how we actually would maneuver through policy and planning. And so Rashad and Justin talk about 3 dimensions that they think are really essential to achieve reparative planning: public recognition, material redistribution, and social and spatial transformation. So they're asking us to move not only from kind of memorial or apology through to resource redistribution, and then to a change that would be not only bigger in the fabric of cities, but also a bigger kind of political and systemic change around who has power. And so over the past 10 years or so, I've been thinking about Portland's moves toward equity planning, anti-displacement, and degentrification as it attempts to plan or replan for and with the Black community of Portland, and asking whether we are achieving what reparative planning is, what the obstacles to that might be, and then what kind of seeds of hope we might be planting. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this is really kind of conversation around work that's happened over, again, probably like a decade of time, right? So everyone in here is an urbanist, I think. So let me not belabor the context, but to give you some specificity for Portland, this is the redlining maps that we all know are very much in a conversation about the sort of long embeddedness of racialization of space. But in Portland, these redlining maps happen before a significant African-American population lives in Portland. They're really not about Black people at all. They're actually about other ethnic white people for the most part, and a little bit of people of color. But Black people really did not live in the city of Portland in any numbers until World War II, because Oregon entered the Union as a state which explicitly prohibited Black people from living there. It's a sundown state. So Black people did not really appear in Portland until World War II, when the Kaiser shipyards recruited some tens of thousands of Black laborers from the South to fuel the war working machine, right? The shipyard machine. So these maps are a thing, but they work a little differently in Portland than they do in some other places. Also, I just make the note that since that time, Portland has annexed a large portion to the east of the original redlining map. And so now this is more what the city of Portland looks like today. And that becomes important because the geography of race today includes this broader East Portland. So Black folks show up to work in the Portland shipyards during World War II, and immediately are faced with, unsurprisingly, pretty intense racism. Again, it's a state that banned Black people from living there. So there was a lot of distress around these new folks moving into the city. And the location that was chosen by kind of the powers that be, the realtor industry, the Klan-infused elected leaders of Oregon, of the city of Portland, was that Black people should live in the Albina district, which was the redlined area. So already this kind of disinvested, quasi-industrial spot was where we will put the Black people into this red area on the map. This is right here. So that becomes the destination of choice for steering and corralling Black folks after World War II. Many people actually left the city because the city fathers actually invited the national president of the Urban League to Portland to ask them, will you please take your people somewhere else? Will you actually get them to leave the city? They said, no, we are not going to do that. They established the Urban League of Portland at that time, but many Black folks did move to Seattle or Oakland because the hostility was so intense. So if we fast forward into the urban renewal era, again, we kind of know and understand this history, but these same locations then become prime targets for slum clearance, interstate highway construction, and the creation of the Memorial Coliseum, the now Moda Center where the Portland Trailblazers play, and the interstate highway system. So where you see on the left, a little bit of the highway system is constructed, but you can see this kind of geography of like bungalows, and then the sort of beginning of the building of the trench that is I-5. I want to point out to you this bridge on the left background and the grain silo that is right there, because we will see that again from a couple of different angles. This is a large grain silo. Portland is a working river waterfront, industrial waterfront, not unlike here. So again, a couple of other angles, and there you see the sort of grain silos and where the Memorial Coliseum is today. So if you've been to NBA game in Portland, this is the zone that you're in, and then going north from there. At this time, 95% of all Black people in Oregon lived in these neighborhoods, and they all bind a district. It's not a 100% Black neighborhoods by any stretch of the imagination, ranging from 50 to maybe 80% Black, but it is where the whole community lives. Not a big community. Portland is and has been about 6% Black in the central city this whole time. Urban renewal practices in Portland continued apace well into the 1970s in the sense of the slum clearance, raise it to the ground. I like to show this picture because for a long time in the city archives and in the newspaper, we only saw photos of this demolition on the left that were in black and white. And they would often show a sort of historical photos of this building from the little Model T Ford kind of era of photography. This actually was demolished in 1975. This was the heart of the Black business district. And this cupola, actually, they moved onto a park in the neighborhood to be the cap of a gazebo. It's a point of, people have very mixed emotions about that. On the one hand, it is a historical presence that has, because it is a park that lots of Black folks hang out in, it feels nice, but others refer to that as the beheaded cupola. So this was a key Black business area. This was the last and final large-scale demolition that was done on behalf of Legacy Emmanuel Hospital in order to create not so much actual hospital expansion, but to create what was a metaphorical moat around the hospital to keep the neighborhood from encroaching upon the medical center, to create a sense of safety for suburbanites who would be coming for care. This is literally their planning documents and consultants saying this, not my surmise. They said you need to create a barrier, essentially, of parking. This on the right is a picture from just a couple of years ago. That lot has been vacant, was vacant for about 40 years after that point. What is happening to it now, you will find out momentarily. But it was vacant for 45 years, completely vacant. So we have a rapid switch. If you know Portland and the story of kind of Portlandia in the early 00s, the sudden kind of attention and excitement about the city of Portland, the switch was really flipped. In 2000, the city designated a new urban renewal area in Northeast Portland. And yes, we still call it an urban renewal area. We're not sugarcoating that at all. They did that to build the light rail extension, and it supercharged gentrification in the area, massive public investments, and immediately a lot of private market following. These are beautiful neighborhoods. They're close in. They have beautiful historic parks, beautiful homes, and for anyone coming from a place that's not the Pacific Northwest, they didn't really seem that scary or dangerous. People in Portland will say, we never thought that Albina could gentrify ever. They saw it as such a ghetto and such an undesirable location, so overwhelmingly Black that people wouldn't want to move there. But if you're moving from Milwaukee, it's kind of no big deal. So gentrification really starts to supercharge. At one point, Portland was called the most gentrified city in the country because the expulsion, the displacement of Black folks was so intense. About 30,000 Black Portlanders have been pushed out of Albina over this period of time. So this is 1990 to 2010. There are no longer any majority Black neighborhoods in the city of Portland. There's no neighborhood that has more than 50% Black people. And at this point, most of Albina is about 20% African American, whereas the district as a whole was more like 75% African American at its peak. This is like quite visible in the landscape, but it is still the home of, for example, the headquarters of the Urban League, many Black churches, and other cultural institutions. This has not happened without resistance, of course. People have been mobilizing for years to try to address the way that public policy has increased and accelerated gentrification, including things like the Portland Development Commission doing like well below market value dispositions of properties in their control, and at one point, a sort of tenants' rights infrastructure that allowed for no cause, no noticed evictions that were in the context of, constant rent increases were accelerating the push out of long-term renters. It will not surprise you that most Black folks in Albina did not own their homes because of discrimination and predatory lending. So there had been a large scandal around predatory lending in the 1990s in the Albina district, in which a lot of people lost their family homes to foreclosure during that time, which again further accelerated the opportunity for someone who, had access to capital and mortgages to buy a beautiful historic property. But quite a lot of mobilization in Northeast Portland, and particularly a battle around the extension of bicycle lanes into the district in corridors where for a long time people have been asking for pedestrian safety improvements and people wanted to have traffic calming. They wanted to have infrastructure improvements, and saying, it's really not about the bikes. The question is like, why couldn't you do this for us when we were asking for stuff? And kind of in tandem, you'll see here, this is the Instagrid of this North Williams corridor. Used to be the Black Business District, but this is like their business association's promotional, association. Like this is the kind of aesthetic that's happening, right? That's that very it's giving 2012, right? It's a cupcake shop, all the cute stuff that was going on. And saying it's the bike is not the problem. The problem is we can't get any of these public investments still in an active urban renewal area that has funds toward us. And you are, again, selling off these properties to do high-end development and not really taking into consideration the long-term history here. So as part of these kind of battles, sort of pressures, negotiations, political moves that were happening, the city did begin to recognize publicly some of elements of their doing and wrongdoing. So public recognition starts to happen one of the key dimensions of spatial reparations mentioned by Williams and Steele. You have to publicly say that you've done something. And as I mentioned, part of that was actually the city going in their archives and no longer showing us a horse buggy, but showing us 1975 in our living memory is when these demolitions took place. So that was actually a really important move. The city archivists are amazing, by the way, really began to dig into and pull up these histories, to pull up and display and create art displays, work with artists, work with community archivists to show how much resistance there had been every time these urban renewal actions took place, how much community members were describing exactly what was taking place and what would take place, to say, hey, if you put the urban renewal district up to here, then those of us on the other side can't get a loan to fix up our house anymore because the banks know you're coming our way. You are blighting us with your policy practices. You are creating this blight and you're just moving it further and further north, which is exactly what happened. And community members with no urban planning training were seeing and saying that very clearly, precisely, and having an analysis of that. No surprise, people know what's going on in their life. But the archivists started to bring that forward and say, hey, we can't just act like this happened to people. On the other hand, some of these memorials were a little bit not so much. So on the left, you'll see the PDC put up, this is a traffic calming device. It's actually to stop people who are taking this corner from driving over into the building, but it has an MLK quote on it. Right? We're gonna, right? And that was supposed to be some kind of public marker of memorial. No one asked for that. No one wanted that. We moved into a phase of murals and muralization. This is actually a beautiful and amazing piece by a local artist, R.V. Smith. But this went up on a building that was funded by the Portland Development Commission, and again, sparked a lot of mixed feelings. People love this artist, and his art is actually extremely pointed and political. But they're saying, okay, so you'll put up a mural with our faces, but you don't want us around, right? Some of the other artwork started to become, again, more pointed. These are a couple of projects. The one on the left I was involved with, which was trying to place a memorial that actually specifically says this was a site of life in which the city demolished homes and businesses to build a memorial coliseum. That was a temporary installation. Some other kind of a slightly more pointed mural saying we're still here. And some apologies were issued on behalf of the city for the urban renewal practices, but very carefully couched in the furthest past practices. So no one is apologizing for creating an urban renewal area in 2000, but they are interested in acknowledging these demolitions that happened sort of before 1975. So is there any material redistribution? Because this is nice, but it's not stuff, right? So the material redistribution, and this is where I'll kind of say some things about our empirical research project that we've been doing at Portland State, have been mostly around affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing, and the practices in the urban renewal area. Again, live urban renewal area in Northeast Portland. Most of the funds from that tax increment financing district go toward housing. And so the city has created this project explicitly to repair the past harms of urban renewal in North and Northeast Portland. There's an ownership component and also a rental component. The rental component is much more significant and substantial, and that's what I'll talk about mostly here. But it creates a preference for longtime and displaced residents of North and Northeast Portland to live in housing that's funded by the city of Portland. Okay, so as a bracket here, this policy is not a racial reparations policy because fair housing law does not allow you to create a racial preference, even in repair of a previous racial preference, right? Housing policy has to be racially neutral. So the city, this is like the first fully enacted of these kinds of preference policies for anti-displacement in the country, created a policy around the urban renewal action itself. right? Again, it's not racial, it's a spatially based policy. It also only uses city funds. So by doing that, they have not been caught up in any sort of challenges with US HUD. But it's basically an intergenerational residence and or displacement from Northeast Portland based on yourself, a parent or equivalent generation, and a grandparent or equivalent generation. You accrue points based on your living in these urban renewal areas. So these are the original 1955-57 in orange, and then getting bigger, and then the turquoise one is the 2000 urban renewal area. So if you have longer ties, you will get more points. You can have been already displaced from the community, or you can be at risk of displacement. You can still live there. You could potentially get preference if you personally never lived there, but your family lived there and was displaced. That becomes more important now, I think, for younger folks. Some really younger folks may have only been there for their childhood before being displaced. It's 2026, so 2000 is now such that people are living independently as adults. And in fact, people came to apply for this who live in East Portland, which is the primary landing zone for folks who are displaced from inner Northeast, from Vancouver, Washington, which is a suburb right across the river, but also from broader places around Oregon, and even some folks from out of state applied who were hoping to come back to Portland. The archivists came with lots of documentation for folks. I think one of the key questions was, how do you prove where your grandparents lived? And it turns out there's lots of ways to do that through community organizations, church rolls, neighbors, testimonies, school district records, all kinds of things. And they also pulled out from the archives specific urban renewal actions where condemnations and demolitions had taken place. So this is an example of like the list for this Legacy Emmanuel project. That people who are on this list get additional specific priority because that demolition of that building with the cupola, which had residential and commercial space, is the only one that was adjudicated to have been undertaken illegally. Later. Again, this will become very important as we come to today, what's going on today, that had been adjudicated to have been an illegal condemnation action. So along with my colleague, Ami Thurber from the School of Social Work at Portland State, we undertook to evaluate what this means for people, because we said, okay, so you've built a bunch of brand new apartment buildings, people are moving in, it's subsidized regulated housing, they're moving into a neighborhood that's very different, that's very changed. Even if you've moved out 5 years ago, there's quite a bit of change in terms of development and population in the neighborhood. How does this feel for people? Like, what are the material things that people are getting? And what is the impact on well-being? The idea of this policy was to try to correct for root shock. So root shock is that many fully loved concept that if you rip the plant up and try to put it in soil, too shallowly, it's not going to thrive. And so people in the city, people around this policy, advisory group members, et cetera, were like openly saying, this is about root shock. We're replanting the soil. We're getting people back into their deep roots. But, maybe it's like too alkaline now. We don't know, because it's a very different Northeast Portland than it used to be. I'll also just make the note that these are subsidized regulated units, so it's quite narrowly defined who can live in them. They also are apartments. They are apartment buildings for the most part. Not the kinds of Portland bungalow single family homes that for the most part people had lived in before they were displaced. You can find our studies about this in the Journal of Community Practice if you want to read about it in great detail. But we basically try to figure out, one, does this policy work in the sense of actually targeting people who have these long, deep ties and advance the racial equity project of the city, why people wanted to get that housing, and then how it's impacted their well-being. People did recognize the neighborhood has changed, and that material redistribution was not sufficient if all it meant was housing, and that they wanted people to actually be able to access all of the increased public amenities and infrastructures in the neighborhood, and also have this sense of community well-being. The sort of naysayers of this policy, their primary argument was nobody really cares about living in this neighborhood. It's just a way to get yourself on the wait list with preference, right? Housing wait lists are long, and they have lots of different things you might get prioritized for. This is just a way that people are doing this. No one really cares about moving back there. This isn't like a place that means things to people. So we wanted to find out if that was true. As it turns out, no, it was not true at all. So one, this kind of policy, a spatially based preference, does work in the sense of being able to find and target folks who do have those deeper ties. So on average, people had spent 39 years living in the neighborhood. This might also clue you into people who are living there are kind of like middle-aged and above. A lot of elders actually have been able to move into more stabilized, affordable housing because of the policy. Most have lived more than half their life in the neighborhood, and those renters are about 70% African American. Again, this is not a racial preference. So any person, and we've surveyed and interviewed, a couple hundred residents, and some of them are not Black, and they have as many generations of ties to Northeast Portland as African Americans do, because it was never an exclusively Black neighborhood. And they're equally excited to be in the neighborhood that they grew up in and they love, and they have friends and family. People have friends and family in the neighborhood still, even after gentrification. They mostly applied to this program because of their connection to the neighborhood. So many people that we surveyed were not on other housing wait lists. They got into this program because they wanted to live in the neighborhood. The place connection, these kind of place connection stats are well beyond the typical finding in the literature around place attachment. People are very intensely tied to Northeast Portland. Again, the whole Black community of the state lived in the same place. Everything was there. When people describe their life in these communities, it's like these cousins, my mom and them, everyone went to 2 high schools, and it's a really big deal. If you went to Jeff or you went to Grant, you're going to talk about that for the rest of your life. It is a very close-knit community, and it is very place-rooted. So people are intensely interested in coming to this place, and they feel like it connects to who they are. They're able to access these cultural institutions, these community spaces, right? You always feel comfortable where you're from. People, even in a neighborhood that might be 20% African American, that is so much more of a proportion than most of Portland, that people still, even at that level, feel a palpable difference in their day-to-day movement. Like, I will see a Black person on accident today because I've left my house, and they feel really a sense of protection from that. At the same time, there is the flip side as well. A lot of changes have taken place. It's a really mixed bag. For folks who have moved, so on the left is some sort of the positive things. For folks who have moved back to the neighborhood, particularly those who move from the eastern edge of Portland, they are experiencing materially a much better neighborhood condition. Outer East Portland is not like our vision of Portland. It does not have sidewalks. It does not have paved streets in many cases. There's a lot of food desert, transit desert, library desert. It's just that the infrastructure from a planning perspective is just objectively poor. And so moving back to Northeast Portland is to move close to jobs, close to many frequent transit lines, community colleges, healthcare centers, beautiful parks, right? Old growth trees, everything that you think is good in a neighborhood is there. That's one reason that people wanted to get back, right? They were like, hey, don't try to snow me. This is not just a nostalgia about, my historic Black community memory. I see the stuff. The stuff is better, and I want to live with the better stuff. And you've made it even nicer now because you finally repaired the things that we had wanted. So of course people want to live there. For folks who live in regulated housing, it can be much more economically stable in terms of things like rent increases, knowing the rent, what the rent is, et cetera. And again, people have really deep place connection. Essentially, every cultural event for Black folks in Portland is still in Northeast Portland. The summer Juneteenth, the Good in the Hood, street fair, the parades, everything is still in Northeast, and people do not want to move those events to anywhere else. So people are really excited that I could walk. The number of people who said I could walk to Good in the Hood, again, was a lot, as opposed to having to drive across town. And their friends and family and kin are still around the scene. On the other hand, overall, the cost of living is increased quite a bit. The kinds of grocery stores that are there are different. The kinds of restaurants, the local neighborhood bar, it's a different flavor, it's a different tone, and it's a different price point. So sometimes people are struggling with some of that cost of living, particularly for like basic grocery stuff. Regulated affordable housing can be very stressful to live in, as it turns out. Many of the buildings that were built, these are newly built buildings for this program. And again, people who were used to living in a single family detached home, to move into an apartment is quite a change. Not only in terms of the personal space that you have, but also relation with neighbors. And to our local community development corporation industry is kind of for the first time during the time of this policy, not just in this area, but around the city, managing large multifamily buildings, which was not the typical for affordable housing in Portland. Even our largest public housing developments were townhomes. They were not high rises. So there's some tensions there around how one kind of gets around in an apartment. And there are multiple flows of wait lists into these buildings. So everyone who lives in the building is not coming through this Northeast preference policy, and there's sometimes some clash around sort of program types. But also, some people, about 60% of people who live in the buildings, in these rental buildings, say that there's a lot of racism in the neighborhood. We had some really intense conversations and focus groups and interviews with people talking about their experiences of, everything from microaggressions to pretty aggressive, explicitly racist behavior that they were experiencing in the neighborhood that's compounded by this race class dimension. So if you imagine a neighborhood that is it is mostly single family detached homes that are now predominantly owned by white folks and that are at a price point that is anywhere from $500,000 to over $1 million. And then you have these 5 and 6 story apartment buildings that are 100% affordable housing, below 60% median income, and predominantly Black. So there's this micro segregation on the block to the building level. I did an interview with someone who lives in one of the buildings who was like, well, evidently this is still the ghetto and everybody knows it, right? They know us as being from the ghetto, even if they don't think they're a block away, they don't live in the ghetto, but we do. There's a feeling, a palpable feeling. Some of it is the tensions that happen all over the city between new multifamily buildings that don't have a lot of parking and the neighbors down the street. Those clashes over, are you parking in front of my house, happen everywhere in Portland, but they have an added dimension and flavor. And probably the number one thing that people say in the interviews was, people keep asking me where I'm from. Neighborly, friendly way of saying hey, well, where are you from? You just moved in. I'm from here. You're new. I'm not. Right? And so there is a feeling that people who live in the neighborhood now, who are the gentrifiers, quote unquote, they don't know the history of the neighborhood. And to be honest, if you walk around in Northeast Portland, much of Northeast Portland, there's no reason that you would ever think this is a historically Black neighborhood. There's no marker or visual thing in the visual culture or anything of people that you would see that would say to you, oh, this was the heart of the Black community if you just moved to Portland today. So there's some desire for an attempt to do more of this kind of public memorialization, public memory, but also to say we're not just in a museum, we're here right now, and we live with you. And for the most part, when we, really working with the residents, we had a resident advisory council, worked closely to try to put this research out, and they themselves concluded, if this is some kind of restitution, you could have done us better than this. A little tiny apartment, really, really almost impossible to buy a home through the program because the prices are so high. And we're not getting the full sense of community development that we were promised. And again, I would just emphasize, this is only subsidized housing. So this is also not restoring the vision that people had of a multi-class Black neighborhood at all. This is a low-income program. So what's going on then in the sense of a bigger social and spatial transformation? So, I should say before I move to that, these are limitations of housing policy, right? Like our housing policy is a very narrowly conceived, it's a very tiny amount of resources really in the world. The city fought very hard legally to get this policy through. Like they really went hard from the city attorney's office to get this cleared through every hurdle that was placed in front of them in terms of fair housing to make this possible. So I don't want to suggest that nobody cared, they weren't trying to do the right thing, but this is the model. You get a tax credit, you get some money from the city, you build an apartment building, that's how it works in affordable housing. But this kind of larger community development that was kind of imagined has not really come to fruition. No urban renewal money for that. So what is going to happen then in terms of this larger spatial and social transformation? Is that possible? Is it possible to achieve like that full vision of reparations that we started from Williams and Steele? So here's a couple of examples. This is kind of in the news. So I mentioned the Hill Block. The Hill Block is the name of the block where the building with the cupola was on, right? So the City of Portland and Legacy Hospital got in a protracted negotiation because, as it turns out, the terms of disposition of that piece of property was the hospital would develop on it. So when they hadn't developed on it, and again, because of community organizing pressure, the city finally said, wait a second, we should open the books. We should look at that agreement and find out, why is that a big vacant field? It's not even a parking lot. It's just a big unmowed lot, and figure out what we can do. So they determined between the two of them that actually they didn't want to get in a lawsuit, and they will turn it over into a community development corporation for redevelopment. This is just broken ground. There's a new nonprofit that is building some ownership and some rental housing, and they're going to have a big business hub. Again, recognizing that was a Black business hub, they're recreating a Black business hub. So that's giving it back to this kind of community-based organization. But what about the actual people whose homes were illegally condemned that were on that list? Those descendants did not care for this agreement. They then sued the city, saying it's not the community that needs to have that material repair. It's actually us. They actually working with MERP students, Masters of Urban and Regional Planning students at the Toulon School, generated some pretty staggering estimates of real estate value that they would have if they had not lost those properties to slum clearance, based on the kind of the area around them and what they would have been able to sell that property for. So just in June, the city council approved a settlement, and it's called Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association too, because there was an Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association in the 1970s that was fighting, which is how that clearance became adjudicated as illegal, because they fought legally at the time in the 70s. They just weren't able to stop the demolition. So the original financial settlement proposed was $2 million. City council decided to increase that to $8.5 million. So among those families, they have an $8.5 million settlement from the city that ostensibly will be paid by the Urban Renewal Agency to them in repair. But that's a real challenge, right? When you're talking about these spatial repairs, are we talking about individual people that we can see historically in the archive? Are the individual party that's harmed? Are we talking about some kind of big community thing, or are we talking about both? Right? So in this case, we have both. But what is really interesting, and maybe this is a little bit too small for you to see, and I apologize for that, but these additional pieces that the EPTA 2 got in this settlement is other property that they get to pick to develop. They are going to have a Descendants Day, so that public recognition where the city has to have a public ceremony to talk about this every year. They are creating a film about the Albina district that the city is going to help them get financing for. They're not going to finance it, but they're going to support their attempts to get financing. And really interesting, the Keller Auditorium, which is a big theater downtown, is going to be redeveloped, and the descendants get to sit on the design and renovation committee. Why? Because Ira Keller, who it's named after, was the chairman of the Portland Development Commission, who approved the demolition and pushed for the demolition of their homes. So they said, let us in to that process too. So they will be involved in the process of the Keller Auditorium. So broadening that idea of what is like owed to us is to stop memorializing people who have done harm in our community. Broader spatial reclamation is also happening in Portland. So again, this is our zone of interest, this area at the bottom end of Albina where the highway and the Coliseum are, and you can sort of see that in progress here. First is an organization called Albina Vision Trust. They are a new kind of visioning and development organization that is dedicated to reconnecting and rebuilding this south end of Albina. They've already built one affordable housing development, and they've acquired the large headquarters of Portland Public Schools, which was in this area. It's a massive site, and they're trying to acquire more property in the area. This is mostly like parking lots, like kind of turnouts for trucks and stuff. Like it's very much the stadium and then kind of nothingness. And they have a vision to try to reconnect this. They launched their project with these images, visions, and pictures, saying, hey, people need to see, they need to get a sense of what this looks like. And we need to ensure that even though, yeah, it's gonna look like, it's gonna have a mixed use building, it's gonna be a 5-over podium, that is not inherently gentrification. Like what makes that gentrification is that it's like a for-profit building that's to the taste of other, it's for other people to make a bunch of money. We can have this building type and have it be for anyone we want. We can have it for the community. We can have community-based things in it. It's just that we need to densify. So they're very serious about climate action, about environmental justice, about reconnecting to the river and cleaning up the brownfields down to the river. They're very serious about that, while also making sure that there's sufficient and enough housing for people to live in. They made sure that all of their renderings, like they got the extra, rendering software with the Black people in it. So they got the little Black people walking around. You'll see like, if a flag is up or something, it'll be like an Ethiopian flag, just to note that. I should mention there's a lot of East African descended folks in Portland, so Somali, Ethiopian, etc. So they'll make sure that there's like little nods and markers to all of these different cultures. They do a lot of work around indigenous folks as well, recognizing like the indigenous connection to the river, but also, that Black people worked in the river, worked on shipyards, and are part of that history as well. And so this is what it looks like. So I say, this is all parking lots, the PPS building, the Coliseum, which is empty, and then this is where they're rebuilding and reconnecting down to the river. This is their vision. So they said, sizzle sells. We got to show people the picture so it looks good, because this is a generational project. This is a multi-decade project and many, many billions of dollars project that they're envisioning. I showed you those grain silos many times, because the grain silos, which are defunct, they were on fire at one point, it's a horrible EJ mess, has now been acquired by the 1803 Fund. It's a new investment fund that was created. It's not the same as the Albina Vision Trust, but they have in part funded some things Albina Vision Trust does. They've acquired this whole site so that they can advance that vision even further. So that will let them make some of these connections down to the river and start some of that brownfields cleanup, which again, imagine connecting that to, a commitment to like green jobs and job training and et cetera, as well as the environmental benefits and the potential for redeveloping. Who funds the 1803 fund? Phil Knight. So basically, one of two billionaires in Oregon, the founder of Nike. It is an investment fund. It is not a philanthropy. It's like a private equity fund. So for me, this raises some real questions about the grassroots democratic participation and transform politics of it all. I think we can hold that tension that if you're going to be a billionaire, I guess, putting a bunch of money into redeveloping specifically and explicitly in a restorative and reparative way with a very serious attention to Black history is good. It could also involve a participatory grassroots democratic action, which it does not. It's an investment fund. The relationship of these entities to the NBA and to the Portland Trailblazers is also a significantly at issue at this time. So from a very grassroots movement, the Anti-Displacement Coalition, Community Alliance of Tenants, which is a people of color-led tenants organization, fighting for tenant protections, anti-displacement measures, and the comprehensive plan, fighting to get the North-Northeast housing policy, getting statewide rent stabilization, all of these things that have happened because these organizations figured out how to use Portland's participatory planning culture and get into plans and get into the policy process. That's really what started this movement, right? What started the idea that we had to have community benefits on projects in the URA was grassroots movement. It wasn't a CEO. What got the city to finally open the books and look at the Hill Block property disposition was like a relentless campaign of action and lawsuits by community members, right? So I think there's an opportunity, there's the potential to bring that back. And we're kind of in a really interesting space right now where some of these community-based planning efforts, and again, here's one about Black Portland, which explicitly tried to bring us all the way to East Portland. We call it the numbers because it's the high numbered streets, to say Black Portland's not just Northeast, it's all the way out to East Portland. We need investment there too. We're in a tension, right, between some of these visions and then the reality of implementation, which again, I showed you a vision of redevelopment that is, again, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars of reinvestment that will be needed between brownfields, highway redevelopment, and all the construction of those projects over time. How do we kind of get into a phase of implementation and resources while maintaining and holding on to that real social and spatial transformation, the political institution transformation that was part of that idea, that vision for reparations, right? The People's Plan was another element. And I love to have this here because the People's Plan was centered around this question in a place that does not have very many Black people at all. What would it feel like? What would the neighborhood be like? What would the city be like if this place loved Black people? What would that look like and feel like to you? This document has generated a tremendous amount of action, of community folks picking up different pieces of it and trying to push forward policy changes. The People's Plan ended up being very much involved in the 2020, the organization behind the People's Plan in the 2020 protest movement to address police violence, which in Portland is quite extreme, right? There's not very many Black folks there, but Portland Police Bureau has been historically quite extreme, very connected to white nationalism, and has a very, very bad track record, and in fact is under Department of Justice settlement and has been essentially continuously since the late 1960s for discrimination. So, these are all the kinds of grassroots actions that have been really essential to moving forward some of these policy and development pieces, but how do we like keep holding on to that that power building and that movement so that we keep going in a direction of reparations. So I think there's kind of these aspirations. A lot of people, we love to talk about repair and reparation and restitution and planning. I mean, everyone doesn't love to talk about it, but those who love to talk about it like to talk about it. And there's some really serious technical challenges here. There's property rights, takings, fair housing law. There's a lot of limitations on subsidized housing programs. We are also now facing this, I shouldn't say these are not challenges on the same scale, but the Trump administration, which has pulled back much of the funding that was going to be used by Albina Vision Trust in the Reconnecting Communities program to address the highway restoration. The Reconnecting Communities is a US DOT program to address like these exact urban renewal projects. Portland had a $500 million grant that's been pulled. So how to move that project forward without that $500 million is really difficult. When ODOT, Oregon DOT, is not particularly interested in the restoration project. They would like to widen the highway, actually. And they are moving forward to widen the highway rather than to reverse widen the highway, yeah. Mm-hmm. And now the Trailblazers. So the Blazers are about to be sold. In moments, the new owner will come on and has demanded maybe up to $1 billion of public money to renovate the Moda Center where the Blazers play, and that is also a significant like redistribution of resources toward that project. But it is central to that district. So what's the political move there if you're trying to redevelop in that area and you need them to play with you? You need that entity to engage around things like our temporary parking lot for the Moda Center that we're going to let you have and develop on or buy and develop on. They can't, like, can you be in an antagonistic relationship? How is that going to work, right? On the other hand, on the positive side, so I can try to end on some positive note. In general, Portland is pursuing a social housing agenda more broadly, and that has the possibility for Northeast Portland to move away from this very narrowly considered exclusively very low income to expand rental housing, to expand to lots of different kinds of tenures, including community land trusts and co-ops, and more income flexibility so that people don't, like improve their economic circumstances and then have to move out of the neighborhood again, which is one of the things that has happened for folks. But to kind of create, to try to again recreate some of that broader neighborhood, less of a class and race segregation. There's a lot of generational leadership evolution happening right now in Portland, as there is in lots of places. So we're seeing more kind of younger generation, people who are more interested in more creative venues, people who don't have as many ties to Northeast Portland and would like to do projects like these in East Portland or even out in the suburbs where Black folks are living to try to support Black folks more broadly, and to see that as part of reparations as well. And then just on a very basic level, I have to say, I'm not from Portland. I lived there for 15 years. It's a small community. It can be hard to break into the community. It can be hard to come and try to like work and study and do organizing alongside of folks who have very tight, long-standing connections. When you didn't go to Jeff or Grant. But this incredibly resilient and really improvisational survival of the community, I think, I have nothing but faith that people will figure out a way through this moment that we're in and move forward to these North Stars or new North Stars, new visions, new ideas, because they're surviving up in the little corner, top left corner for a long time, figuring things out and, constantly improvising in the face of bigger changes that are out there. So I think that we will continue to like move and evolve towards spatial reparations. But that's kind of where we're at right now. Yeah. So thanks for hearing about it. And I'd love to take questions.
If anyone has a question, I have a mic that I can pass around.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. I had a question about Portland, its history Oregon more broadly, that you mentioned as like the sort of white spatial imaginary, like no Black people here, right? And but it's sort of current day reputation, at least how I imagine it, as like progressive, very liberal, scare quotes around those. But, this sort of sense of, particularly for white folks in Portland, right? And so I'm curious to know how that sort of tension, if you will, of like its history, sort of how the place carries itself now. You mentioned like Portlandia, how that sort of works with or against your sort of organizing efforts that you see. Like, is there sort of like, I don't know, more willingness? Because again, there's this like sort of idea of a current day Portland of how it should be or whatever. How that sort of factors in the advocacy work.
Yeah, so Oregon has this really long and deep history around like white Christian nationalism. Came into the Union as a sundown state. It was run by the Klan. It was the biggest Klan state outside of the South in the early part of the century, and still has, particularly Oregon's Republican Party has very deep ties into neo-Nazi movement. I'll just be extremely frank about that. Very much connected to white Christian nationalist movement in Oregon. It's like we have this progressive reputation in Portland, but like in the state of Oregon, there was attempts to like ban gay teachers in the 90s. Like real serious statewide political movement. So it's like there's a tension. There is a tension that's very present now, still continued today. In the city of Portland, as a place that people moved to, particularly in the 2000s. So people are moving there. So there's always like new people. Most of them are white people, which is fine. People are white. But that's the progressive part. That's the progressive reputation. So interestingly, from like a policy and planning standpoint, I think that Portland is really down with like innovation. They like to get ideas from other places. They like to do new stuff. They like to be a leader. They love to say we're the first people who have this policy. I mean, they love it. They love to talk about being a leader in policy and planning. So experimentation and innovation there's not a lot of blocks to that per se. And I think that because there is at least like a nominal or surface level interest in equity, justice, the city has an office of equity. Everything is supposed to have an equity lens. We're standing up to Trump and saying we still care about racial equity. All that jazz in the Pacific Northwest. The challenge is like, how do you actually then implement that beyond statements, right? Okay, so now you have a land acknowledgement at the beginning of your talk, and now you added a land acknowledgement, and then you said, oh, also Black people were here. Okay, and now what? Like, when are you going to move some money? When are you going to move some power? And so that's the state I think that we're in now, which is like, how do you actually begin to shift decision-making, resources, et cetera? One of the ways that that's happening in organizing is the reality is I moved to Portland 15 years ago, and there was a recognition at that time that the under 18 population was more than half people of color. And so as we go through time, it just becomes like politically a different constituency, a different body. And so the organizing happening there, it's like, we're going to have to amass some people power here. I think our biggest block is actually that Portland's a small town. And Portland we are not a Seattle. We are not connected in like the global tech industry, for example. So when we're having a fight over development or what's happening downtown or whatever, the oligarchy, if you will, are local people. It's like, I am a local guy. I am a sixth generation Oregonian. My great-grandfather owned every surface parking lot in the city of Portland, and now I have a real estate empire. That's who we're fighting. It's not like an Amazon. We're not San Francisco, right? So in some ways that makes it easier because we can reach out and touch those people. We can see them. We can talk about them as very real people. We can see exactly how they're acting. They're talking to the mayor down at the swimming pool at the country club, right? We could see that, but they're also very entrenched, right? We have like a very kind of entrenched old boys network and elite group, and so I think that's like been an interesting shift to sort of talking about that more openly, getting past Portland Polite, which is Portland Polite is like a thing. You don't do antagonistic work. For a long time, that was the case, and now I think that's shifting because the antagonisms are becoming are rising to the surface, like the contradictions especially now in moments of like scarcities, economic, like Portland has been struggling a little bit. It's like these antagonisms are rising to the surface, and Saul Alinsky tells us, yeah, dial it up, right? Don't beat. Make that sharper. And that's what's happening right now. So I think it'd be interesting to see how that goes. Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so I had this question. When you were talking, especially about the land acknowledgement and stuff, about this idea of reparations for Black people, and there's obviously a significant Indigenous population in Portland and in Oregon broadly. And I guess I'm wondering, particularly when I saw the "we're still here" and knowing that that's like a huge settler colonial sort of messaging, just how is that?
Yeah.
Because I'm actually only seeing these reparations things in high Indigenous areas, and I'm kind of a little weirded by it. I want to know the vibe. We don't have a huge population here in Philly.
Right.
We're not getting reparations anyway, but it's good to know.
Right.
But,
yeah, that is a space of a lot of tension. So Oregon, the state of Oregon has got a pretty significant and active organized Indigenous nations, right? The Confederated Tribes, who were in the 1960s among the first to have their lands taken and redistributed by the assimilation from there was this moment where the US government was instead of having these sovereign tribal nations, why don't you just become a racialized group? And Oregon was one of the first places that they did that. So there was a massive land loss in the 1960s, which was nominally tied to civil rights, because it was we have civil rights now, so you guys can be a race and then you can have equal rights. And I think that also set up a really unpleasant antagonism with Black folks at that moment, because it was wait, you guys got that thing. We're not a race. We're a different thing. So that's a weird, but in the city of Portland, which has one of the largest urban Indian populations, everyone is not connected to those nations. They're from all over the place, and have been less organized around land in the city of Portland. So if you go to Vancouver, BC, the nations there are oh, this inside the city of Vancouver is ours. We are building something here. We want something here. That's less so in Portland. There's a lot of fighting about land outside of the city, less so in the city. But I think it's important that Albina Vision Trust very explicitly talks about indigeneity and connecting to Indigenous land. That's for real. And trying to work with groups to do things we're going to have that's equally a part of our project, as they are saying, hey, if you're Somali or Ethiopian and you weren't here for the urban renewal, but you're in here too, is an intentional attempt to do bridging. But there is actually quite a bit of tension, I think, in between those spaces. It's very I was gonna say unsettled, no pun intended, but yeah, there's some real tension that is not at all resolved, or in my view, moving toward resolution. Unfortunately. Nope. Someone in the back here, and Sydney also had a question.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I'm really specifically excited about the People's Plan, and I just wanted to ask kind of a follow-up. I mean, I think it's specifically impactful in being titled Plan rather than Vision, though it is incredibly visionary. I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more to the process of putting that together and what the engagement process was like, and the generative, process of that document, and how you would like to see it, ultimately, as it's been used, ultimately leveraged in this ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I worked closely on this plan We wanted to make a plan because Portland is a planning city. We were like, cool, we can do that. We can do a plan. Engagement-wise, and sort of the spirit of the project, it was very important that the community engagement started from the numbers. So rather than rooting the conversation in historic Northeast Portland, we went the other way around. We started from East Portland, people who have already been displaced and are trying to create their own space because it's so underserved. It's underserved as a physical infrastructure, but Black folks who live in East Portland are like among the most underrepresented in the city. East Portland is viewed as an immigrant destination. So if you're African American, they're not talking to you. Like the city of Portland, the organizations, they view Northeast as where Black people go. So there's no like conversation with African Americans, many of whom live in East Portland, with what's going on in their place. So we started from that, and then our second lens was youth. Okay, leadership, our boomers, we need to talk to youth. So we work with a lot of youth organizations. And that's like where a lot of this vision piece came from, was like, we got to talk about the vision of what is it, but try to ground it in like, what does that manifest in the built and economic and social environment? And to have engagements that involve like a wide variety of creative activities. But to try, like, I think the big challenge of that was to try to convince people that like planning and making a plan is not like a white people thing, because the dominant culture of Portland planning seemed very white. But to try to unpack that more and say like, okay, but is it really that only white people ride bikes? No, you ride a bike. Like, is it really the only white people like want to have a big garden? No, obviously not. Like everyone's granny has a garden. So, you know, kind of making a space where it was like, instead of feeling like, because I'm in an antagonistic space, I have to like resist everything that's going on, which is, to me, is like the psychological thing that's happening when you're like, that is only for white people. Like, it's, everyone knows in their head that that's not true, but it feels really bad to be in the room. And so there's like this reactive moment. So it's like, okay, well, we're going to be in the room by ourselves. We're going to talk about things we actually do and things we actually want. And then what would that look like? And does it look different? Or is it just that actually you need to do it for other people? It's not that you don't want there to be a bike lane. It's that you want the bike lane to be where you actually live and not where you got displaced from and can't afford to be. Oh, okay, now we understand what's going on. So there's different like pieces of it. All the different sort of planning, you know, policy areas are touched upon. And, you know, it's designed to like be able to take the pieces around with you, but also to update. So like, for example, the public safety component of that, or administration of justice, I think it's called, like, has been really reworked, especially post 2020, and like organizational conversations about how do we want to address the way, specifically the way that policing and incarceration impacts into the built environment and space and place, right? The over surveillance of some neighborhoods, the kind of quote unquote $1 million blocks, like how many people have been lost from the neighborhood to incarceration, and how does that like shift our public resources toward prisons rather than to neighborhoods, et cetera, right? So all that stuff. So it's also kind of like mixy matchy. You can do more things with it. Yeah, and so actually people, I think some of the city bureaus in particular have taken the pieces that suggest things in policy and they're trying to work them out. And then it's just a question, again, I think always of the organizing, the pressure and accountability holding, because it's really easy for people to adopt these goals. It's very simple to be like, the preamble of my plan now says this. It's harder to put that through all of the paces of actual policy making, rule making, programmatic function. Yeah. It's a very beautiful document. Shout out Rob. If you can look it online.
Can you do one more quick question?
Hey, so when you were talking about the preference plan, You mentioned that most of the participants were renters because the Black homeownership was low. I was wondering, did the program have any sort of assistance or help for however small the population of homeowners may be that might need to conduct home repairs or anything like that? Because I could see how it would result in like a displacement if not. Yes.
Okay, I'm excited, Cindy. So I should say the reason the homeownership part of this program doesn't work well is because it's a down payment assistance. It's a little bit more of a moderate income, but if you make like 120% of median income and then you're looking at houses that are $800,000, the math don't math with a $30,000 down payment grant. So then they started increasing the down payment grants even more, and things just got a little bit, it just didn't make any sense. So now they've switched to a strategy of actually building like new build for home ownership. So that is trying to move that forward. But yes, there's also a home repair program. I'm very excited about it because the thing I personally was advocating for years and working with, I got one of my like community-based org buddies to help me. We go around, make presentations about this, was that they had never tied the home repair program to any kind of homeownership preservation. So it was like you could get a grant to do home repairs, but then, like 20 minutes later, I mean, not instantaneously, but you could like end up selling the place. And so one thing that's really visible to me, at least, is that because of mass incarceration of Gen X, because of the war on drugs and war on gangs, there's a missing generation in the transfer of property for Black people in this neighborhood. So you've got like grandma living there who's now very elderly. You've got big adults who are not present or are not like stabilized or cannot take on a mortgage. And then you got like young people, which might be teens to 20s, who are not also prepared to take on a home that also like needs a bunch of repairs or whatever. And so people were losing their houses, or they were like, okay, I can fix it up, I could sell it. And there, it's more money than I ever thought I would get, but it's not nearly what you could get. So one of the things that they added into the program was, is estate planning. So one of the legal service nonprofits called Commons Law actually got Black attorneys, young Black attorneys who specialize in estate planning, to work with families to make sure that the home repair was tied together with estate planning. So it might be that you want to transfer that property later, you want to sell it, but like you're going to sure as heck know, who's getting the money, what is the market value, how exactly is the delineation of property working, so that we're not in situations where like realtors are knocking on the door when they see an obituary, which is what was happening, or scammers are showing up to, get grandma to turn something over, or, 17 cousins are coming out of the woodwork and no one is like prepared to move the thing forward. So it's something that was very close to my heart, was that it needed to be done. It needed to be done in a way that recognized and like paid attention to Black family dynamics and understood things like, the reason that like this auntie whoever can't have this thing is because auntie whoever was in prison for 15 years and now doesn't have a credit record. And like, we don't need to shame that. We don't need to judge that. We just need to, but we need to understand that that's what's going on, right? So, and not to say that that's happening for everyone, but like, there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done. Or like finding out that like, oh, the person who lives in this house has been living in the house for 20 years, wasn't the owner after all either, because it got passed down from someone else. Or like, people really need a lot of help to like dig through the paperwork and the deeds and find out the stuff. And so they've been able to add that piece into the home repair to try to get more preservation. And also, trying to add a little bit more touches of like financial capabilities, like do not get scammed. These are predatory things. Like don't, here's how to find reputable people. And make sure that if you're going to take out a home equity loan, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, that you're doing it in a safe and sustainable way, et cetera. So trying to add some capacity around that. But you can also repair your home, but there's just not that much. There's not so much Black home ownership left in the area. Unfortunately, that stuff came so late in the game. Yeah. All right, it's time for the snacks.
Yep.
I see the refreshments being unveiled. Thanks, y'all, for coming to talk to me about this.